Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar discussing Biden's first 100 days critical labor law updates for employers. This free webinar is available exclusively for our customers enrolled in our subscription services. I'm Stephanie Blicki, the Corporate Accounts Executive for Personnel Concepts, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Rosie Merlon, who serves as our Senior Regulatory Researcher.
Hello and good afternoon to our attendees. I'd like to welcome Zachary James as our guest speaker. Zachary is a solo practitioner business attorney located in Chicago, Illinois. A graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, he has worked in private practice as well as the SEC Office of Small Business Policy. His practice focuses on business compliance, employment law, corporate governance, and securities.
Hi, Rosie and Stephanie. I'm excited to be here today. President Biden's first 100 days in office. It's been a pretty crazy time. There's been a lot going on. He first, and one of his most major things was addressing the COVID pandemic. He's passed two major legislative actions so far, right? The Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was basically a stopgap by Congress, a few more weeks to negotiate a larger package. Then the American Rescue Plan Act, which expanded and extended a lot of the CARES Act programs. Besides focusing on COVID, President Biden's also taken a lot of steps on gender, diversity, and other equality measures, as well as started laying the groundwork for his next very big and his first post-COVID drive, and that's his infrastructure plan, his Build Back Better, his Build Back Green infrastructure plan. So there's a lot going on. I'm excited to jump in and get started discussing it with everyone.
All right, thank you, Zachary. We're definitely looking forward to discussing this topic with you. Before we proceed, we just want to make sure everyone is able to hear and view Zachary clearly. If you have any audio issues, please check the volume on your computer or mobile device. If that doesn't solve the issue, please let us know in the chat and we'll work to improve the audio as best we can. Now, let's just take a look at today's agenda.
Okay, so as Zachary mentioned, today's agenda focuses on providing an overview of the various legislative action and employment law initiatives that have had the greatest impact on U.S. employers thus far in the Biden administration. We'll start off with an overview of the extensions allotted to the Paycheck Protection Program and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, also known as FFCRA, unemployment insurance, and other notable COVID-driven business programs. Then we'll cover key executive order developments, those rescinded, delayed, and signed during the current administration, including efforts to increase the federal minimum wage. Then we'll cover COVID-related updates required for workplace, including vaccination policies and the effects of OSHA's new COVID National Emphasis Program. And lastly, we'll review the most notable Biden administration appointees. The webinar will conclude with Zachary providing best tips for employers and answering questions from our audience.
Okay, and the format for today's webinar features a series of questions that we'll be asking to Zachary regarding the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. The purpose of this webinar is to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter herein. It does not constitute legal advice. The applicability of the laws discussed today may depend on your state, type of business, and number of employees. We recommend working directly with legal counsel on specific matters pertaining to employment laws affecting your business. Personnel Concepts, our webinar host, and our guest speaker are not liable for any errors, omissions, or changes in laws.
Okay, thank you. And we'd like to start off the webinar with our first poll. So please go ahead and select all that apply. What are you most interested in hearing about today? Expanded unemployment insurance benefits, tips for applying for government assistance, newly released executive orders, EEOC guidance on workplace policies, and new Biden administration appointees. So go ahead and select all that apply. What are you most interested in hearing about today? We have a lot of votes coming in, so we'll leave it open for another moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and get a few more votes in, and then we'll close this off. Okay, so let's go ahead and share our results. Okay, so it looks like most of you are interested in newly released executive orders and EEOC guidance on workplace policies.
Okay, and before we begin, Personnel Concepts is offering all of our attendees our vaccination programs and the workplace white paper, along with today's slide presentation equipped for note-taking, which is attached as a handout right here in GoToWebinar. At the end of the session, you'll receive a downloadable certificate as proof of your attendance today. Also, I want to invite everyone in attendance to submit any questions you may have during the presentation by using the Ask Question feature in GoToWebinar. You can also pose questions in the question window. Most of those questions will be saved for the end of today's session, but those that are relevant to the subtopic being discussed will be posed where appropriate. And then at the end of today's session, you'll have the opportunity to use that raise hand feature in GoToWebinar to pose a question directly to our guest speaker. So with that, let's get started with today's presentation.
Okay, so Zachary, the continued effects of the coronavirus pandemic led to an extension of the Paycheck Protection Program, or also known as PPP. Can you give us an overview of the program and the changes that came along with its extension?
Sure, Rosie. So as you said, Paycheck Protection Program, also known as the PPP program, was originally $690 billion set aside in the CARES Act to incentivize employers to keep employees on the payroll. Unemployment is usually governed on the state level. So for the federal government to take action quickly, they wanted to keep people off of unemployment. And to do so, they used the IRS to incentivize that to happen. And what it was a 1% interest loan, 10 months of no payments, and then the loan will be forgivable if certain criteria was met. That criteria is basically employment levels had to be maintained at what they were pre-pandemic. 60% of the loan had to be used on W-2 wage spending, and the rest of the loan had to be used for eligible expenses. And generally speaking, eligible expenses were expenses that kept your business operating. You also had to be a small business, as defined by the SBA. What that is differs from industry to industry, but a good starting point is less than 500 employees. Now you're actually eligible for a second draw on the PPP program. So the same amount of the first draw, you can get that again, but you have to show a 25% reduction in gross receipts in an entire quarter as compared to the same quarter in the prior year. ARPA came and made a couple changes to the PPP program too. One, it added a little bit more money, $7.25 billion. And then it extended the application period from, at that point it was ending March 31st. ARPA and some follow-on legislation expanded that to May 31st for applications to be submitted, and then the end of June for processing of those applications. Another pretty significant change that ARPA made was, so micro businesses, sole proprietors, those who are freelancers who work through an LLC who don't take a W-2 wage were kind of left off in the original CARES program because all the numbers were based on the W-2 wage amounts. So what ARPA did was allow those individuals or small businesses to use their Line 7 1040 income as what their income was, is their comparable to the W-2 wage in the process. And that number is a lot closer to the gross revenue of the company, so it is a fairly large amount for those freelancers. Also, to just finish that up, to incentivize small business owners to apply, President Biden had declared a small 2-3 week period when only the smallest of businesses were allowed to apply. That ended at the end of March, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. And let's go ahead and do another quick poll for our listeners. Similar to PPP, another program that recently received an extension was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So how would you rate your understanding of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act? Go ahead and please select one. So we have unfamiliar, I need a full explanation, moderate, I am familiar with the general purpose, proficient, I understand the details of the act, or expert, I can administer the program without guidance. And we'll give our audience a moment to answer that. Okay, and it seems like a couple more votes are still trickling in. Okay, so it seems like the majority of our audience has voted now, so let's go ahead and close that and share our results. Okay, so most of you are moderate. I am familiar with the general purpose. That's good news.
Okay, thanks to the audience for participating in our survey. Now that we have a better understanding over your knowledge of the FFCRA, Zachary, can you go over the specifics of the program and the extended leave benefits? Oh, Zachary, then you might be muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks for catching that early on. So like you guys said, the FFCRA is a mouthful. It's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And what it did was originally it required employers to offer paid sick leave and family leave and medical leave to their employees. And then to incentivize that and not to incentivize it, it was mandatory. To offset the cost of doing that, there was about a dollar for dollar tax credit offered up to specific limits depending on what type of leave it actually was applied. So there was a period from December to the beginning of April where this program had actually lapsed. ARPA picked it up again and restarted it through the end of September, but removed the mandatory nature of it. So no longer are employers required to offer these additional leave benefits, but they still can, and they can still get the tax incentives. And those tax incentives have actually been increased. So for emergency sick leave, now an employer can deduct up to $12,000 per employee. And then for emergency family leave, up to 80 hours of paid work. And it's not just emergencies and people actually being sick with COVID-19. There's a lot of different instances that qualify that you might not think qualify, I think. So to point a few of them out, the time it takes to go get your vaccine, as well as recover from any side effects of that vaccine are covered. Quarantining while awaiting results, no matter if those results turn out to be positive or negative, is also covered. And then finally, caring for dependents who are either recovering from a vaccine or quarantining awaiting results, but also caring for dependents who don't have a place to go, right? So if your child's school has closed down or their daycare has closed down, you can have some paid sick leave to watch over them during that period. There's also a lot of states enacting their own, usually very similar laws. So this is one of those areas where I would highly suggest you use a local attorney who's more up to date on your specific state laws.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. And another expansion in response to the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in changes to unemployment insurance eligibility. Can you review the changes we've seen to unemployment during this administration?
Sure. So there's been a huge expansion of unemployment, and the idea being trying to capture every single person who has suffered some sort of employment-related hardship from the coronavirus pandemic, or just any hardship in general. So we'll go through a long list of these. The first one's the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. This is normal unemployment, but it's been expanded from the traditional 39 weeks up to 53 weeks. And this program ends in September. And just so I don't keep repeating myself, these programs all end in September, either the beginning of the month, 6th, or the 30th. Next one would be the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. This is assistance for individuals who don't take a W-2, right? Business owners, freelancers, sole proprietors, people who just maybe just have an LLC, fill out their Form 1040, and don't pay income taxes on it. And this is 79 weeks. These people are eligible for up to 79 weeks of unemployment coverage. The next would be the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation. And this is that highly publicized, highly debated package back in March and June. And it was originally an extra $600 in unemployment payments per week for someone already collecting unemployment. ARPA has extended this to go all the way through September again, but it's now only $300 a week. So still a lofty bonus, but not nowhere, only half $600 that it used to be. The next program is the Mixed Earner Unemployment Compensation Program. This catches those people who are in between the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation Program and the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, right? Those individuals who collect a W-2, but also have a side gig, right? They work as an Uber driver on the weekends. And this is an extra $100 a week if the person's already collecting some form of unemployment compensation, some form of W-2 based unemployment compensation, and they made it at least $5,000 last year from their side job. The next program is the Short Time Compensation Program. This one is designed for those who have not been laid off or furloughed, but have seen a reduction in their work hours. And what it is, it's money put to the states. The states can determine how to prorate that based off of the amount, based off of the reduction in hours a person has seen. So those are the major programs. One side effect of these programs was the income tax on unemployment compensation, right? There were a lot of people collecting unemployment for the first time this year, and they didn't really realize how the system worked. They didn't realize that they had to pay income tax on unemployment earnings. So what the IRS did was forgave the first $10,200 of unemployment income for each worker. So that first $10,200 made on unemployment is not taxable in 2020. And the final program would be the COBRA premium subsidy. So those who have lost employment, employer COBRA coverage can have 100% of their deductibles subsidized all the way through September. Their deductibles and their premiums subsidized through September.
All right, thanks for reviewing all of that information with us. In addition to those we've discussed so far, what other COVID-driven business programs should employers be aware of?
Yes, Debbie. So as you know, there's tons of resources for employers that have experienced a loss of income. I'll go through some of the most notable, the larger ones. So there's a restaurant revitalization grant. That's $28.6 billion for operating expenses, as well as construction of outdoor dining spaces for non-franchised, smaller restaurants. There's also the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. That's $1.25 billion set aside for entertainment venues that have had to completely close their doors throughout the pandemic. Small Business Administration also has a couple of programs, a notable one being loan deferment. So those who already have SBA loans can have those loans deferred for an extended length of period. No need to make payments on them, and no interest accruing during that period. The final one would be the Employee Retention Credit. Originally, employers were incentivized even further to keep employees on payroll by being able to receive up to a $5,000 tax credit per employee kept on payroll. The CAA increased that from $5,000 to $7,000. So I think that covers really the gamut of all the programs that are available, at least at a very high level. At this point, it probably makes sense to jump in and talk a bit about some of the tips I have and some of the things I've seen in applying for these programs, and sort of I guess, my list of best practices. So there's a lot of loose money going around right now. There's a lot of opportunities for businesses to find programs that are applicable to them and get some government assistance. My first suggestion would be to make sure that you're taking the assistance that you're actually supposed to be taking, right? There's money flowing right now. The government's trying to get it out very quickly, and moving quickly is not something any government's very good at. As the COVID dust settles, we're likely to see a lot of agency action to claw some of this money back, and some political incentives to find bad actors that they can hold up as a sign that politicians are good stewards of taxpayer dollars. Right, we're already kind of seeing this with the IRS, where they're gearing up, getting a huge increase in their budget to try and collect a lot of unpaid taxes going forward. And so in that light, so make sure you can you're applying for programs that actually you're supposed to be getting, and document the entire process. Document your evaluation of if a program is applicable to you, as well as how you're spending that money. So if an agency like the IRS does come knocking on the door, you've got all the paperwork, all your ducks in a row to show them.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. Those are definitely some great tips there. And before we move on to reviewing recent actions surrounding executive orders, let's engage the audience with another poll. Other than PPP, has your business received government assistance as a result of a loss incurred due to the coronavirus pandemic? Go ahead and select the one that best fits you. Yes, we received additional government loans. Yes, we received grants from the government. No, we weren't able to find any additional resources. No, we applied but were denied additional assistance, or no assistance was needed. Your answer is anonymous, so please go ahead and vote. We'll leave it open for another moment as votes are still coming in. Okay, and let's go ahead and, okay, still see a couple more votes coming in, so let's give it another moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that and share our results. Okay, so it looks like many of you did not need assistance, so that is definitely good news. Followed behind split down between yes, we received grants from the government, and no, we weren't able to find any additional resources.
Okay, thanks to our audience for answering that for us. Now, some of the swiftest actions taken by this administration took place in the first couple of days by way of executive order. Zachary, can you provide an overview of the executive orders that will have the biggest effect on employers?
Can do, Stephanie. Yeah, so as you said, a lot of swift action took place in the first 50 days of President Biden's appointment, right? He issued 34 executive actions in the first 50 days. That was double what Trump and Obama both did. And while executive actions are usually vague in nature with little immediate application, there are some that are worthy of note, and I think some are COVID related, but what's more interesting is that these actions very early in the administration started laying the groundwork for President Biden's post-COVID plans, and that's his green infrastructure plan. So first one I'll mention is Order 13999. That was an order for OSHA to focus enforcement efforts and focus enforcement efforts on where they'll get the most bang for their buck, as well as issue workplace guidance standards for operating in a non-lockdown COVID world. Next executive order would be 14005. This created the Made in America office under the Office of Management and Budget. So this kind of harkens back to the Bush administration days where government, or the thought was that government contracts should first go to US-based companies, and at least they should get the first shot at them. And this office seems like its role will be to assist all of the other agencies in making sure that happens. The next executive order is 14009. This one mostly surrounded the Affordable Care Act and just simply reversing all of Trump's actions taken to slow roll that program. So what Trump did during his administration was actually in the first couple days of his administration, probably in the first 50 days, was to issue a bunch of executive actions that told the agencies enforcing the ACA to just stop what you're doing, slow roll it as much as possible. We can't overturn and stop the program together, but we can do everything we can to get in the way of it. And President Biden's executive order here, 14009, simply reversed that. Told the agencies to get back to work and get ACA back on the path that it's supposed to be on. Executive Order 14007 created the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. This is mostly an advisory board at the moment, but it seems that the role of it is going to be advising top government officials and agencies on how to better use scientific data and making political decisions. The final one I'll mention is Order 14017. And this was in order for a 100-day review of the U.S. supply chain to find weaknesses and opportunities, right? So the supply chain review to figure out what infrastructure opportunities are out there to be implemented in Biden's plan.
Okay, and thank you for reviewing those with us, Zachary. In addition to the legislative action taken through executive orders, there has also been movement in our congressional legislative bodies with specific interest to increasing federal minimum wage. Can you give us a status update of those efforts?
You're right, Rosie. So with the CAA, as that was getting debated, there was also in addition to it, that was to increase the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15. That bill ended up failing and ended up being stripped out of the CAA because it didn't directly relate to how that Appropriations Act, the political technicalities that act is going to get passed under. But by no means is an increase in minimum wage debt. It's still around. There's still rumblings with it, and more than rumblings, there are already a few new bills on the table from both sides of the aisle, right? So first is the Raise the Wage Act of 2021. This is a Democrat-led bill. It wants to increase the minimum wage to $15 by 2027. Next is the Higher Wages for American Workers Act. This is a Republican-led bill led by Senators Mitt Romney and Tom Cotton. It wants to increase the minimum wage to $10 by 2026, but then peg it to inflation moving forward. And then finally, there's the Blue Collar Bonus Tax Credit Act. Once again, a Republican-led initiative, and this wants to offer IRS tax credits to those making less than $16.50 an hour. Right, so both sides of the aisle, a lot of support for a higher minimum wage in some form. This could be an easy win for a Biden administration who's trying to work across the aisle. An easy win for them to get in the first few days or the next few days.
Okay, thanks for reviewing those recent developments. I guess we'll have to see what happens. But, another topic that's been at the forefront for employers is application workplace policies related to COVID-19. Can you review any considerations for employers to reference when developing like testing and vaccine policies?
Sure. So I think one of the big concerns that people have is that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act, has some regulations and guidance that seem to be in conflict with what we're hearing are best practices for a COVID-safe workplace. Right. The big example is medical examinations. Once an employee is hired, they're generally not allowed to be subject or required to take medical examinations of any form. Now, screening for COVID, whether that be with a temperature gun or an antibody screen or a fast screen, however it be, is a medical examination. So, right, that seems to be in conflict with the EEOC guidance. Now, thankfully, what the EEOC has said was they've come out and basically said that while there may be conflicts in the long run between CDC and OSHA guidance, as well as and what the EEOC says, EEOC guidance, compliance with CDC and OSHA guidance, at least the most up-to-date guidance, is sort of a safe harbor, right? If you comply with those two sources, then you're most likely good to go. Now, the problem with that is CDC and OSHA guidance is changing pretty frequently, and it can be somewhat of a field of minds. There's a lot of sort of nuances and differences you have to know. So, and a good example of that is while you can currently screen employees for COVID, you can't do so with an antibody test because the antibody test does not meet certain criteria, a certain legal definition of required. It's not allowed to be used at the moment, but that could change.
Okay, thank you for going over the EEOC and CDC workplace guidance in response to the coronavirus. And before we discuss OSHA's recent counteraction, let's get the audience involved with our fourth poll of today's webinar. Okay, so what is the current status of your workplace safety policy program? Please go ahead and select one. You do not have one. You're using the same policy program from before the pandemic. We have updated our policy program as new requirements arise. We're looking to update but are unsure of how to do so. And not necessary, our business does not require a safety policy. So please go ahead and select the one that best applies to you. And looks like most of the votes are in, so we'll go ahead and close this here in just another moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and share our results. Okay, so many of you have updated your policy program as new requirements arise, and that's definitely good news. Definitely want to stay up to date with those new requirements as they come out.
Right, thanks, Rosie. So, as mentioned, OSHA recently took action in order to further combat the effects of the COVID-19 exposure in the workplace. Zachary, can you review the specialized program that was developed to carry out the efforts?
Yes, Stephanie. As you mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, with the first executive order, President Biden is instructed OSHA to focus enforcement efforts through a national emphasis program on areas where we're going to get the most bang for their buck. So focus on super spreader areas first, and then essential businesses at a high level. So the program's a 12-month program aimed at stepping up workplace safety enforcement at these critical locations. And the goal is that OSHA will have 5% of their enforcement actions from a somewhat long list of applicable industries. So just to summarize that, if your industry is on this list, you're at a higher chance of inspection from OSHA in the next 12 months. So what's not included on this list are healthcare industry. Is the healthcare industry? They go by kind of a higher standard. You know, on this list, they're number one. But it's just kind of a whole different ball of wax how that's enforced. But so you look at these primary targeted industries. They're all industries where the risk of a super spreader event is pretty high. So food processing, essential retail stores like supermarkets that cannot close. And then they have a secondary industry list, which is basically just essential businesses, right? Food and agriculture, construction, energy, chemical, transportation and logistics, critical manufacturing, and then commercial facilities.
Okay, and what enforcement and guidance from the OSHA National Emphasis Program can be applied to all employers and general industries?
Yeah, so OSHA does have industry-specific guidance for basically every industry. I would suggest that you go look at their site for your specific industry. But on a general level, OSHA's inspections are going to focus on COVID, obviously. It's going to focus on the COVID-related practices that you've implemented, things such as safety and health plans, contingency plans in case you have an event and you need to quarantine the entire office or business, and then the availability of PPP and social distancing policies. So now OSHA does have, like I said, industry-specific guidance, and then a summary of that guidance, which is 16 major points and then a few dozen sub-points for each major point. But generally summarizing that in a kind of a short way, what an employer should do is first assign a workplace coordinator to be in charge of everything COVID related in the workplace. That workplace coordinator should be empowered to do a hazard assessment of the workplace and then identify and implement measures to combat those identified risks, the risks they've identified in that assessment. So some possible measures that could or should be taken is eliminate hazards by separating and sending home infected or even potentially infected people, implement physical distancing in communal areas wherever possible, and where not possible, install physical barriers, issue PPP equipment, right, face coverings, and everything that goes along with that. If possible, improve your ventilation, right? Even if you're not running the air conditioner, get more high-powered filters and run the fans so you're getting fresh air through the building as much as possible. Provide hygiene for good, provide the products needed for good hygiene products, right? Soap and alcohol dispensers, conveniently located, things like that. And then increase your cleaning and disinfection standards, right? If you have cleaners coming in and they're vacuuming and they're only vacuuming, maybe they should also be doing disinfectant wipe down surfaces.
All right, thanks for going through all of that, Zachary. I actually have a question that might be on the minds of some of our audience members. With the recent appointees taking office based on Biden's nomination, which have been the most impactful for employers, and what can we expect from them as time passes?
Yeah, Stephanie, I'll talk a little bit more about that. So with Democrats only holding small majorities in both the House of Representatives and Congress, but them campaigning on the fact that if they get majorities in both, they're going to get a lot done. The Democrats need to get a lot done, but they don't have as much power as they kind of have said they would have to get that stuff done, right? Basically, every Democrat needs to be on the board for any legislative action to pass. So it's likely the Biden administration is going to rely heavily on agency action to move the ball forward on certain key areas. So it's looking at the heads of these agencies kind of gives us a good indication of where that ball is going to be trying to move forward. And I think something very notable about all these appointees is that it's easy to see the tie of them all to Biden's next step, his green infrastructure plan, more than they're tied to solving the COVID pandemic as it is now. So with these appointees, you can really see that Biden's looking towards the next stage of his administration. The first one I think worth mentioning is Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. He's a global interventionist. He supported a lot of the U.S. conflicts in the past few decades. And what he's come out and said in his stances, and what we're really seeing the Biden administration stances, is that U.S. security abroad is going to shift from focusing on that post-9/11 war on terror mentality to more combating the other global superpowers. So that's China, and then to a lesser extent Russia. Right? We saw this with the Alaska summit, and we're seeing it now again with the appointment of new diplomats for each country. The next appointment is the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, right, former head of the Federal Reserve. Yellen's a Keynesian macroeconomic economist, so that means she believes in demand-driven economics, so spending to spur economic growth. And I think that is a pretty good summary of what we can see out of her, right? Increased government spending, looser monetary policy, looser fiscal policy, much like the monetary policy we saw her execute when she was the chair of the Federal Reserve. She's also come out and made some comments that she could be a proponent of things like carbon markets, so financially trading carbon credits, increasing taxes on both individuals as well as corporations, and then using fiscal policy to not just spur growth in the economy, but to combat inequality. The next appointment is the Director of the Office of Science and Technology, Eric Lander. Lander's interesting because he's not a politician. He's a scientist, an MIT biologist, and he's coming into a new office created by executive order, as I mentioned, and it's not exactly sure what powers this office is going to have and what he's going to yield, but given the money that is going to be put into the green infrastructure plan, and it is a green plan, it's likely he's going to play at least a heavy advisory role in shaping some of the green initiatives in that plan, if not having some executive power in that role also. The next is Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, right, former presidential candidate. His main campaign trail slogan was a once-in-a-century green infrastructure package. So that pretty much signals what he wants to do. He's called it not your grandpa's infrastructure package. And by infrastructure, what he said he means is more than roads and railroads, but basically everything affecting public life, right? Green areas, parks, carbon emissions, the whole gamut of everything affecting public life. The next appointment worth mentioning, Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, former Michigan Attorney General. She was the appointment that went through the easiest, had great bipartisan support. And she is interesting because in her past work, she's been just as interested in increasing, if not keeping, employment levels as on green initiatives, right? So I think with her, there's a nice balance where you're going to see that the government's not going to be as willing to sacrifice jobs in certain industries, certain energy industries, to be specific, at the cost of pursuing greener initiatives. The next appointment is the chairman of the SEC, and that's Gary Gensler, former Goldman Sachs partner. He's very pro-financial regulation, was instrumental in the crafting Sarbanes-Oxley, as well as Dodd-Frank. And it's going to be interesting because the Trump administration took steps to kind of roll back the enforcement of those two acts, and obviously him being crafted them, he's going to be keen to see them brought back to where he thinks they should be. But there's also a lot of interesting security issues on the table right now, right? Cryptocurrencies, payment for order flow would be two of the very big ones that have just been in the news a few past weeks. Finally, is the Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. He's a former Boston mayor, as well as, and I think this is the key, union representative. So he, right, he's a union guy. He's going to be just as interested in keeping jobs and working and helping the blue collar worker as he is advancing other initiatives. Something interesting I think we're going to see him address in the next few months, if not a little later, is the classification standards for an independent contractor on the federal level, right? Some states, California, Montana, and Washington, I think are a few, have taken up if certain workers should be reclassified as employees, even though they fall under independent classifications as traditionally written. And they've actually, right, California's passed a law to make that the case. You think of like an Uber driver. And it's going to be interesting to see and so given that some of the states are already implementing it, it's likely that Walsh is going to at least examine doing something about those standards on the federal level.
Okay, and thank you for sharing those appointees along with their potential agendas while in office. And do you have any final tips for employers as we follow developments from the Biden-Harris administration?
Yeah, Rosie. So kind of just to summarize everything we talked about here is, one, there's a lot of government at least at the moment, loose government money out there. Examine the opportunities, see if you can apply for some of them, if some of them are applicable to you, but make sure you actually are supposed to be getting that money. There's likely a program out there for every type of business, but make sure you're using the right program and document that process very well, because who knows how the political environment is going to change 8 months from now. You know, if inflation starts running high and the government's trying to claw back some of these trillions to put into the green infrastructure plan, which the money for has not been found yet. And then if you do have to lay off employees, I think there's an opportunity to generate a lot of goodwill with those employees by making them aware of all these programs, unemployment programs available, right? It's not much work for one employer to take all that information, synthesize it in an easy to understand format, and then distribute that to all their laid off workers. And helping your employee land on his feet once being laid off is going to go a long way into into building trust and building a loyalty to the company and getting them to come back when you no longer need them laid off. As far as workplace safety standards go, compliance with OSHA and CDC guidelines are your best practices, as well as you need to take a look on a state level and see if anything is implemented there. And then the final point, one day COVID is not going to be what it is now. I don't know if it'll be gone away forever. And the Biden administration is keen to start spending money on their green infrastructure plan. And so there's something to keep an eye on there for American business to find opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Zachary. And before we move on, we'd like to remind our audience to please go ahead and submit your questions that you may have for our guest speaker. Before we move on to those questions, let's go ahead and do a final poll question for our audience. Which topic of the webinar would you like to see more content of? Please go ahead and select all that apply, PPP and FFCRA extension information, executive orders and minimum wage, COVID-driven relief and enforcement programs, vaccination and workplace policy guidance, Biden-Harris administration agenda updates and predictions. So this will help us curate more content for our subscribers that's relevant to information that you want to see more of. We have quite a few votes coming in, so we'll go ahead and leave that open. Please go ahead and get any questions in as well so that we can present them to our guest speaker. Okay, so it looks like most of our votes are in, so let's go ahead and close that and share our results. Okay, so, this is kind of all over the board here. Most of you want to see vaccination and workplace policy guidance, followed by COVID-driven relief and enforcement programs. And a vast majority of you also want to see PPP and FCRA extension, executive orders and minimum wage, and Biden-Harris administration agenda and updates. So that's good news.
Okay, well, thanks, Rosie. Before we end today's session, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can find a customizable certificate of attendance for today's webinar in the handout section of your toolbar. Now let's take a moment to answer some of the questions from our audience that have been submitted through the presentation. So Zachary, I have a question here that says, am I correct in understanding under the FFCRA, we are no longer required to offer the paid leave, but can if we want to and still receive the tax credit?
Exactly. The FFCRA program is no longer mandatory, it's no longer required, but the tax incentives have been reset in some instances and increased in their limits. So if you've offered those in the past and used up all the money, there's more money for you to offer those again.
Great, thanks, Zachary. And we have another question here. Is an employer permitted to make the COVID vaccination mandatory before an employee can enter the workplace?
So I'm not directly aware of a CDC guidance that requires making that mandatory. Yeah, I would have to look more into that and get you an answer for that. I'm sorry.
No worries. We can send a follow-up on that as well. Appreciate that. We have another question that came in that says, can you touch on the $12,000 tax credit per employee? That includes the time an employee takes off to receive the vaccine?
Yeah, so it includes a lot of things. The time it takes to, well, so it's $12,000 for emergency sick leave, 80 hours of paid wages, and I believe there's a limit on how much you can, the hourly rate, for family sick leave, emergency family leave. Now that can be taken for a lot of different instances. Basically, a good way to generalize that whole list is if it is something that's stopping the COVID spread, it's probably covered.
All right, thank you. I also have another question here that says, if employees are on unemployment, does it go against your account?
I'm not sure what the question is account there. So if what account means in that instance, if an employee is collecting unemployment, they have that employee collecting unemployment is a government-employee relationship. It does not have any effect on the employer.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if they have more specifics, you can, whoever asked that question, you can go ahead and post it in the box if that didn't answer your question. And let's see, I have someone asking, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or maybe it's another follow-up, but someone is asking, where can I find an OSHA hazard assessment checklist or form?
So it is readily available on the OSHA website.
Perfect, easy enough.
Yeah, and just to dig on that, they will have hazard assessment forms, sort of like that, the 16 points of the breakdowns underneath it, as well as industry-specific ones also. But it's pretty. If you go to the OSHA site, you're going to find it in 3 or 4 clicks.
Great, thank you. I have a question here. Is family COVID medical credit still at 2/3 of normal pay?
Yes. And I believe, I don't know what the exact number was, but there's a dollar cap on it also.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm just looking here. Give me a moment, see if we have any unanswered questions. If you have any other questions, you can pose them in the questions box. And then we will follow up with the answer about the vaccinations. We have a question that's not COVID related. They're asking, it's not COVID related, but if we pay our staff for all breaks and lunch and they get hurt while out on lunch, is that a workers' comp claim?
No. I mean, right, there's a lot of nuance to that question. It could go a lot of different ways. But generally, right, if they're at McDonald's and you pay for the McDonald's, no.
Okay, appreciate that. I know that wasn't COVID related, but I have a question here. It states IRS tax cut up to $10,222 per employee.
$10,200 per employee. That is $10,200. I'm guessing they're referring to is the unemployment tax cut. So if I'm collecting unemployment, my first $10,200 of earned unemployment is not taxable.
Thank you for clarifying that. I have a question here that states, can an employee continue to collect unemployment if they are called back to work?
No. And that's kind of right. There was a big problem with that back in June and March, where some businesses were opening back up, but because of that federal pandemic unemployment compensation program, that extra $600 per month or per week, workers were making more money on unemployment, and the employers, what they were supposed to do was tell their state level unemployment commission that this employee is actually able to work, but is choosing not to. But obviously that's not, if you're a restaurant owner and you're tattling on your bartender, they're not going to be too happy with it. You're going to be in a bad situation. So a lot of people were collecting unemployment even though they could work.
Oh, I see. Okay. Thank you for answering that. And I think this was tailgating on the question earlier about their account, but I think they said, I believe the person was asking if it would impact their unemployment rate as it changes based on who was let go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, your rate would increase. Yes. It works just like typical unemployment coverage, no matter which program it is. And also, I should mention that's on a state level, so it might differ from state to state. Unemployment is usually covered on the state level.
Okay, thanks so much for answering this. I have somebody asking about getting a copy of today's webinar. Yes, we will definitely be sending out the recording of today's webinar after the session to all the registered guests. So that will be available. I think we might have answered all of our questions here. Was there any last minute things you wanted to state, Zachary?
I guess I'll re-echo what I said earlier. It's kind of my final points. There are lots of programs out there, and they're not a typical government program, where it takes 1.5 years to apply, and you have to appoint a full-time record keeper to actually use the money. This is a very streamlined process, and the government worked very efficiently in getting money out into the public quickly. I think a lot was learned from 2008, 2009. So look and see if there's money available to you. You write that PPP for sole proprietors. I've heard people applying, like clicking on a link on Facebook, applying, having the money in 14 days, having tens of thousands of dollars in 14 days. So it's easy, to take a look, apply. Now, when you're doing that, make sure you document your process very well. So if you have to defend yourself, you can show I did it correctly.
All right, thanks for those last tips. So if any other questions have come in, we'll forward those to Zachary via email, and his responses will be sent to all the attendees in the coming days. I just want to say thank you to everyone who submitted questions about today's topic, and special thanks to Zachary for taking the time to answer them.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy coming on.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie and Zachary. And we enjoy hosting webinars for our valued customers, and as such, would really appreciate your feedback. Please stick around a couple of minutes as a brief survey will open up for you to rate what you saw and heard today. Thank you for attending our presentation. We hope you found this information useful in understanding critical employment law updates in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. Thanks again to Zachary for being our guest panelist. We look forward to continuing to work with Zachary on future presentations. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to view past webinars on demand at the link provided on the screen. To all of our attendees, thank you for choosing Personnel Concepts as your provider of workplace compliance solutions. We hope everyone has a great afternoon, and this concludes today's webinar.